1,119 civilian deaths and at least 1,790 injured, including 99 children killed and 126 children injured. I say at least because we do not yet have the full picture from localities with intense hostilities, in particular Mariupol and Volnovakha. 2,623 civilian casualties have occurred in government-controlled areas, while 286 have occurred in the areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions that are controlled by Russian-affiliated armed groups. Military forces have used explosive weapons with wide area effects in or near populated areas, including missiles, heavy artillery shells and rockets, as well as airstrikes, with devastating consequences for the civilian population. These weapons have caused massive destruction to civilian objects, including private houses, multi-story residential buildings, administrative buildings, medical and educational facilities, water stations and electricity systems, leading to disastrous effects on civilians and their human rights, including their rights to health, food, water, education, and housing. The extent of destruction of civilian objects and civilian casualties strongly suggests that violations of the principles of distinction and the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks have been taking place. On the 3rd of March, 47 civilians were killed when 2 schools and several apartment blocks in Chernihiv were destroyed, and all indications are that these were the results of Russian airstrikes. On the 9th of March, Mariupol Hospital number 3 was destroyed, and most likely this was also the result of a Russian airstrike. 17 civilians, among them children and pregnant women, were injured. 1 injured woman was helped to deliver by cesarean section soon after the attack, but neither she nor her baby survived. The doctors operated on them in candlelight. On the 14th of March, at least 15 civilians were killed and 36 injured in Donetsk. We're looking into allegations that those casualties were caused by a missile with cluster munitions launched by Ukrainian armed forces. We remind all parties involved in hostilities that directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as so-called area bombardment in towns and villages, and indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law. These attacks, which may amount to war crimes and which cause immeasurable human suffering, must stop. The toll of these attacks on the civilian population is immense, with the humanitarian situation now critical across the country. The civilian population in many areas is in need of urgent medical supplies, food, water, shelter, and basic household items. The situation of civilians in the besieged city of Mariupol is appalling and getting worse by the hour. They face constant shelling, street fighting, and each day less and less of the necessities to sustain life. We have observed a considerable increase in mortality rates among civilians in a number of besieged cities beyond those that can be explained by civilian casualties. These deaths can be attributed to a lack of access to medical care and medication, food and water, and other stresses that people suffer in areas where hostilities are taking place. The military attack has resulted in mass displacement in the country, with UNHCR reporting 3.8 million persons who have fled the country and an estimated 6.5 million persons internally displaced. We acknowledge and appreciate the major efforts by receiving countries and expect that they will continue to support those who have fled, as well as ensure an environment of non-discrimination and protection of vulnerable groups, and particularly women within these groups. Since the 24th of February, we have received allegations of Russian forces shooting at and killing civilians in cars during evacuations without giving effective advance warning. We are also following up on allegations that Russian forces killed civilians, including during peaceful assemblies. We have also received 2 allegations of killing in government-controlled territory of civilians due to their alleged affiliation with Russian forces or support of pro-Russian views. We have documented 24 cases of conflict-related detentions of officials of local authorities in regions under the control of Russian forces, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We have also documented the detention of 21 journalists and civil society activists who have been vocal against the Russian invasion in Ukraine, in Kiev, Kherson, Lugansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 5 of the journalists and 4 of the civil society activists were reportedly released, and we're in the process of verifying these reports. The whereabouts of other individuals is unknown. These detentions have been arbitrary and include possible enforced disappearances. We are concerned by the abundance of videos available through open sources depicting interrogations of prisoners of war that have been taken by both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely and not subjected to acts of violence and protected against insults and public curiosity. Cases of beatings of people believed to be so-called marauders, bootleggers, pro-Russian supporters, and curfew violators appear to be widespread in territory controlled by the government of Ukraine since the beginning of the armed attack of the Russian Federation. We received credible allegations of more than 45 such cases, which can amount to torture and ill treatment by civilians, police officers, and members of the territorial defense. We are aware of the increasing number of allegations regarding conflict-related sexual violence across the country. High numbers of women and girls crossing the border with neighbouring countries also led to increased risk of human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. While we have not yet been able to confirm instances of conflict-related sexual violence, we are aware of at least 1 case of rape being investigated by Ukrainian law enforcement authorities. We remind all sides that international humanitarian law prohibits sexual violence against women, men, girls, and boys, and such acts may constitute war crimes. We are gravely concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of civil activists and human rights defenders who have been vocal against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including Crimean Tatars. As hostilities intensify, journalists and media workers are finding themselves in increasing peril in their daily work. As of today, 7 journalists and media workers have sadly been killed in Ukraine since the 24th of February, and 13 have come under armed attack, among which 7 have sustained injuries. At least 1 journalist is missing. His last known location was in an area of active hostilities. Persons in vulnerable situations have found themselves even more vulnerable since the military attack started. Persons with physical and sensory disabilities in locations affected by ongoing hostilities struggle to access bomb shelters or other safe areas. They are also left without access to essential medicines due to the high level of insecurity. Long-term care facilities for persons with disabilities, including people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, and older persons in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Lugansk regions, face an appalling humanitarian situation. Aside from the ongoing hostilities and the lack of food, heating, electricity, water, and medication, residents of such facilities are more vulnerable because they depend on others for care and support. Many have also chronic health conditions. The space for discussion or criticism of public policies of the Russian Federation as the occupying power in Crimea is increasingly and profoundly restricted. On the 4th of March, the Russian Parliament adopted amendments to the Criminal Code introducing prison terms of up to 15 years for those convicted of disseminating knowingly false information about military operations. The same law introduces penalties for discrediting and calling for obstruction of the Russian armed forces up to 5 years in prison. We are concerned that this law has had a chilling effect, forcing some media outlets in Crimea to self-censor their reporting on the Russian Federation's military action in Ukraine. I would like to conclude by emphasizing the commitment of HRMMU to continuing our monitoring and reporting on international humanitarian law and human rights violations in Ukraine. Although the security situation poses ongoing challenges, the mission is fully operational and has adapted its work to this new context. We appreciate the ongoing humanitarian work of the United Nations in Ukraine. We call on all parties to ensure safe corridors for the evacuation of civilians from dangerous areas and to allow the timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population across the country. As the Secretary General of the United Nations stated on the 22nd of March, the war is going nowhere fast and the Ukrainian people are enduring a living hell. It is time to stop the fighting now. Thank you.
We're talking about the humanitarian assistance provided by the UN. Are there any criteria for the civilians to be able to get it?
Sorry, what was it about Ukroport?
It's United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees of UN and Ukroport, that's for news for yesterday, cooperate to provide monetary assistance to 360,000 IDPs that have been affected by the conflict.
Okay, we are the UN Human Rights Office. We obviously collaborate closely with the rest of the UN in Ukraine and follow their work, but I'm not in a position to explain how they are delivering humanitarian aid. I think those are more appropriate questions to go directly to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We are the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Насправді ми представляємо Офіс уповноваженого саме з прав людини, і тому звичайно, що ми співпрацюємо дуже активно з різними програмами саме ООН в Україні, але я не можу зараз пояснювати дії інших організацій, які відповідають за гуманітарну допомогу, оскільки, як я казала, це радше треба питати саме у КПБ ООН, управління Верховного комісара саме з питань біженців, а ми представляємо саме моніторингову місію з прав людини.
Скажіть, будь ласка, ви згадували про те, що є відеокатування як українськими, так і російськими військовими, інших військових. Чи перевіряєте, чи ці відео є фейкові, чи вони дійсно правдиві? Як перевіряєте цю інформацію?
You said that there are videos that show the tortures of prisoners of war by Ukrainian and Russian military. Do you verify if those videos are fake or if they're real? And if you do, how do you do it?
Okay, thank you. We are in the process of further verifying all of the material that has been issued, but on the face of it, it does raise serious concerns. And we have seen videos from both sides, those that have Ukrainian prisoners of war that have been taken by the Russian side, and those that have Russian prisoners of war that have been taken by the Ukrainian side. And we remind all parties to the conflict of their international humanitarian law and human rights obligations to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners of war, to ensure that they are not exposed to public curiosity and that they are treated with dignity. We do call on the authorities on both sides to do full investigations into the allegations that are raised by these videos, so that we hope that they will fully investigate and any perpetrators will be held to account. It is important that these types of videos and that any ill treatment that may happen is stopped immediately and that people are treated humanely.
Насправді ми зараз саме перебуваємо у процесі підтвердження цих відео, цих даних, але те, що ми бачили вже викликає величезну стурбованість. Ми бачили відео, які були надані обома сторонами, тобто як відео українських військовополонених, які були взяті у полон Росією, так і відео російських військовополонених, які взяли російські військовослужбовці у полон. Ми нагадуємо усім сторонам, що вони зобов'язані дотримуватися вимог міжнародного гуманітарного права та міжнародного права прав людини, а саме поводитися з військовополоненими гуманно, не дозволяти їм ставати об'єктами публічної цікавості і поводитися з ними з гідністю. Ми закликаємо, звичайно, уряди провести повноцінне розслідування всіх цих тверджень щодо негідного поводження з військовополоненими. І сподіваємося, що вони проведуть таке розслідування і всі порушники будуть притягнуті до відповідальності. Дуже важливо, щоб всі факти жорстокого поводження припинялися і належним чином розслідувалися, а щоб з військовополоненими поводилися гуманно.
Хотіла спитати щодо того, наскільки чинною в сучасних умовах є діяльність міжнародних організацій, оскільки бачимо, що ні вимоги суду Гаги, ні СЕМ, ЮЄС і НАТО не були виконані Росією, а саме про зупинення війни в Україні.
What do you think are those international organizations acting effectively, because neither the demands of the International Criminal Court nor the demands of NATO or EU have been heard by Russia or observed by Russia?
Which international organization?
She mentioned the International Criminal Court,
Okay.
NATO and EU.
Okay. We have been pleased to see that the International Criminal Court is looking into the situation here in Ukraine. They had already opened some investigation at an earlier stage, and they appear to be looking into it also since the 24th of February. And we certainly welcome that and any other international accountability mechanism that can look into the situation in Ukraine. Of course, it is important that national courts look into any violations that occur and hold accountable anyone who has committed a violation. But often in times of conflict, this is difficult for national courts to fully ensure accountability, and that's where international mechanisms may need to step in, and we certainly welcome that. Yeah, you go ahead.
Ну, по-перше, ми дуже були раді побачити, що Міжнародний кримінальний суд дійсно почав розслідувати ті факти, які відбуваються на території України. Я знаю, що вони вже відкрили декілька проваджень ще раніше, ще з 24 лютого. І ми, звичайно, вітаємо будь-який міжнародний механізм притягнення порушників від винуватих до відповідальності. Звичайно, що національні суди, державні суди також мають відігравати роль для того, щоб притягати людей винуватих до відповідальності, але дуже часто за умов конфлікту це національним судам дуже складно зробити, і саме тому вмикаються міжнародні інструменти.
Regarding NATO and the EU, they're dealing more at the military and political levels, so I can't really comment further, but we certainly welcome any international attention to the human rights situation and the situation of compliance or non-compliance with international humanitarian law in the country.
Щодо НАТО та ЄС, то, звичайно, вони більше опікуються військовою та політичною стороною цього питання, і я тут в цьому аспекті не можу нічого коментувати, але ми вітаємо будь-яку увагу щодо питань порушення прав людини в Україні і щодо забезпечення дотримання норм міжнародного гуманітарного права в Україні.
Червоний Хрест хоче все-таки свій пункт у Ростові на Дону у Росії для допомоги українцям, яких депортували з Маріуполя.
What do you think about the International Red Cross Society willing to open a center in Rostov in Russia to sort of help the deported Ukrainians there from Mariupol?
Again, the way that other international humanitarian organizations are working is really not coming under our mandate, so I can't really comment on that.
На жаль, діяльність інших міжнародних організацій світових не входить у межі нашого мандату, тому я не можу коментувати дії Міжнародного Червоного Хреста.
Чи були зафіксовані випадки депортації саме з Маріуполю до Російської Федерації?
Did you document any cases of deportation of Ukrainians to Russian Federation by Russia?
We are looking closely into that. We are trying to get first-hand information to confirm whether it is in fact the case that people are being forced to go to the Russian Federation. As soon as we have more full details on that, we will publish that and make that public.
Ми зараз дуже ретельно відстежуємо цю інформацію і намагаємося її перевірити. Ми намагаємося отримати інформацію саме з перших рук. Чи дійсно такі факти були, саме факти примусу людей приїхати до Російської Федерації. Як тільки у нас з'явиться підтверджена інформація, ми одразу її публікуємо.
But just to add that if there are any forced deportations or people being forced to go into the Russian Federation, this could well be a violation of international humanitarian law.
Але якщо дійсно такі випадки ставалися, чи якщо вони дійсно будуть підтверджені, тобто випадки того, що людей примушували виїхати в Російську Федерацію, то такі випадки можуть дорівнювати порушенню міжнародного гуманітарного права.
Дозвольте запитання озвучу від ICTV Владислава. Про Червоний Хрест вже була відповідь, такі два питання. Чи не вважаєте ви, що війна в Україні вказала на дієздатність, безпорадність, неефективність структур ООН, в тому числі і управління Верховного комісара з прав людини, чи будуть з цього зроблені якісь висновки? І друге питання, з яких джерел управління Верховного комісара ООН з прав людини отримує інформацію про порушення прав людини на території воюючої України, і наскільки коректною може бути ця статистика?
А можете мені попадати у те, щоб я правильно слышав? So, two questions from the ICTV, right? Don't you think that the war in Ukraine showed that the UN structures are ineffective, helpless, in particular the OHCHR, and what kind of conclusions can you draw from that? That's question number. Do you want to answer that first and then the second one?
Yeah, let's do one by one then. Okay.
Зараз перше, тоді питання.
Certainly, the United Nations is made up of many different parts, and some parts, the United Nations is effectively its member states, and so there are a lot of criticisms that we are aware of, that the member states, as a part of the United Nations, have not been able to effectively deal with conflicts. I leave it up to society to look at that and member states to consider that. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is part of the Secretariat of the United Nations, and we have a specific mandate to follow the human rights situation of all people. And that is what we are trying to do within Ukraine. We have been working in Ukraine since 2014. We've been monitoring and documenting the human rights situation since 2014. We've issued more than 40 reports on that situation. Since the 24th of February, we have been very closely monitoring and documenting the situation in the country. We have released daily civilian casualty reports. We have released both here and through Geneva statements of concern, statements documenting human rights violations and showing how there could be violations of international humanitarian law. And we consider this as very important work, because if documentation is not carried out, and particularly carried out by bodies that are impartial, then nobody will know the truth of what is happening in the country. So we see this as very important. It's also something that can help to lead to accountability. It may not have stopped what has happened, but we hope that it will contribute to accountability in the future and allow people to know the truth of what is happening in the country. And we see that as very important.
Звичайно, що ООН складається з різних організацій, з різних проєктів, і насправді ООН дорівнює тій кількості країн, які є безпосередньо членами ООН. Ми знаємо про ті обсяги критики, які висловлюються щодо неефективності дії ООН в умовах різних конфліктів, але насправді я залишаю це питання на вирішення саме суспільств держав-членів ООН. Щодо УВКПЛ, Управління Верховного комісара з прав людини в Україні, то УВКПЛ, звичайно, що входить в секретаріат ООН, і їхній мандат полягає в тому, щоб відстежувати ситуацію з правами людини по всьому світові. Саме в Україні ми працюємо з 2014 року, і ми документуємо та відстежуємо порушення прав людини саме з 2014 року. Ми підготували вже понад 40 різних доповідей, а з 24 лютого ми дуже уважно, дуже ретельно відстежуємо саме і документуємо саме події, які відбуваються на тлі цього конфлікту. Ми щоденно публікуємо інформацію про випадки жертв серед цивільного населення. Ми і тут, і в Женеві готували різні заяви щодо порушення прав людини, щодо порушення міжнародного гуманітарного права під час конфлікту. І на наш погляд, ця робота є дуже важливою. Саме питання документування, фіксації жертв, особливо якщо це відбувається організацією, яка є безсторонньою. Я думаю, що це дуже важливо для того, щоб потім згодом у майбутньому можна було встановити правду. А також притягнути винуватих людей до відповідальності. Тобто, навіть якщо це не зупинить бойові дії, але це дозволить у майбутньому все ж таки дізнатися правду і притягнути порушників до відповідальності. What are the sources that OHCHR is using to get information about violations of human rights in Ukraine? How appropriate those sources, or how correct the statistics are? That's what the question says. What are the goals of collection of this information? Just to document the violations, or do you foresee any further actions, measures, sanctions, or punishments?
Okay, thank you. In terms of the sources of our information, the main sources are victims and witnesses. We take statements from victims and witnesses of alleged violations. We also use official information. We use publicly available information. We also speak to commentators, to experts, to a range of other actors, to lawyers, to other people who are involved in the issues that we are documenting. In terms of how correct our statistics are, as we put out, for example, in our civilian casualty reports every day, we think that they are an underestimate. That is because we have a strict form of verification. We cannot include civilian casualty unless we have fully verified that individual casualty. We can't take general estimates. We can't take general information. We have to verify each individual casualty, and that takes time, and that means that it clearly is an underestimate. We also are aware that in places such as Mariupol and Volnovakha, we have not been able to get the full information because of the situation that they are facing, because of the lack of communications, the lack of electricity, and so on. We're not able at this time to get the full information, but we continue to work on that, and we continue to document, and we will continue to increasingly get the information that is there. It can take time, though. In terms of other statistics,
Щодо наших джерел інформації, то це в першу чергу саме потерпілі, тобто жертви і свідки порушень. Ми, звичайно, беремо до уваги офіційну інформацію, ми беремо до уваги публічну інформацію, ми спілкуємося з різними коментаторами, експертами, фахівцями, правниками, юристами, тобто всіми людьми, які опікуються цими подіями. Чи статистика є коректною? Насправді нам здається, що ті цифри, які ми надаємо в наших щоденній інформації щодо жертв серед цивільного населення, вони є применшеними, оскільки у нас є дуже точна, дуже така строга процедура перевірки даних, і ми не можемо надавати неперевірені дані. Тобто це не може бути просто узагальнені інформація, узагальнені підрахунки. Ми маємо перевіряти кожен окремий випадок. І саме тому нам здається, що ця інформація є трішки применшеною, оскільки в деяких регіонах, в деяких містах, скажімо, Маріуполь або Волноваха, ми просто не можемо зараз мати доступу до цих людей, для того, щоб перевірити всю цю інформацію через брак комунікації, зв'язку, електроенергії тощо. Але ми продовжуємо далі працювати для цього, для того, щоб все ж таки отримати всю цю інформацію і своєчасно її публікувати.
Just in terms of other statistics, how many people have been detained, other types of violations, what I can say is that they are rising every day, and that we are working hard to try to keep up with the increased numbers of allegations. But again, we do check carefully every case, and that does take time.
Щодо іншої статистики, то зрозуміло, що кількість затриманих людей, кількість порушень зростає, і ми намагаємося все ж таки впоратися з зростанням цих обсягів і його відстежувати. Навіть попри те, що ці обсяги зростають, намагаємося все ж таки перевіряти для того, щоб доповідати про це, але для цього потрібен певний час.
And just on the goals, I think I've already answered that in the first question.
Щодо питання цілей, мені здається, що я в відповіді на перше питання вже відповіла.
Дякую. Будь ласка, чи ваші
Smaller.
Дякуємо тоді всім.
Окей.
Дякую, пане Matilda, дякую, колеги. Завершуємо нашу прес-конференцію.
Thank you for your work.
Thank Thank you.